Greetings. Every so often I'll go through my boxes and boxes of vintage computers, gaming consoles, whatever else there is, and actually take them up, set them up, and try them out. I don't collect for the sake of collecting, meaning that I don't just buy these things, clean them up, fix them if necessary, and then put them into exile in the garage, but I try to, every few months or whatever time span is convenient, I take one of them out and see if they still work correctly. This is an Atari 800, and I got it hooked up to a color security monitor here, a JVC, and I've plugged in a Galaxian cartridge. So let's have a look. Power up this guy. He powers up nicely. And start a game. Well, I don't know if pressing this button is supposed to start a game, so let's hit start. Well, that was nice. You may hear that I keep pressing the button, but the fire button doesn't seem to work. And I'm sure I didn't put it into storage with a non-working fire button. I've tried another joystick. I've tested the joysticks and something else that uses joysticks, and they're good. So the problem lies in here. So what are we going to do about that? I started to look at the schematics online, and you follow how is it wired, how do the pins from the joystick connector go, where do they end up, who processes them and stuff. But I saw, during my search, I saw several references to an Atari 800 diagnostic cartridge that was put out by Atari. It's called SALT, short for standalone test, and what they mean by that is it's basically a field testing thing. You don't have to have scopes and logic analyzers or anything around. You just plug that cartridge in and it tests all of the features. Of course, that's limited. If you have something where the CPU doesn't boot up or you got bad RAM, the SALT cartridge won't boot up and won't do anything. But for a situation like ours over here, where one of the components isn't working right, it sounded like a good solution. Now, where do I get a SALT cartridge? First thing we need, of course, is the SALT code, but fortunately it's been published in several places. There's binary files. There's actually binary files for the different types of Atari computers of that era. And I found an image specifically for the Atari 400 and 800, which are hardware identical, but the 400 was the budget model with a few things left off. So we need a 2764 8K EEPROM to burn the code into. Then we need a donor cartridge to put that EEPROM into. I found this. It is clearly marked. And on the back it says left ROM shorted. So let's see what this looks like inside. So the cartridge has two 4K ROMs in it. And my guess is that basically everything is wired together on these two. Almost all of the pins are wired in parallel, except the chip select lines. And there's nothing else on this board. There's no TTL. There is a bypass cap up here, but that's about it. So now we got to figure out how to get this inside this and get it to work. The first difference you'll see is that 2764s have 4 more pins. They're a 28-pin device, whereas these are 24-pin devices. They had to add another address line to go up to 8K from 4K, and so they just went to a 28-pin footprint because that's kind of industry standard, and most of the, not most, but the next 2 or 3 successors to the 2764 actually utilize the extra pins which aren't all used on the 2764. To come up with a plan of attack, here is what the cartridge we're looking at looks like. As you can see, nothing else. 2 ROMs and a bypass cap. We do need the pinout, which is kind of on the listed on this sheet, but this shows the pinout of the edge connector on the cartridge. And all we really need function-wise is we need address line A12, and fortunately that is provided on the connector already. So functionally we should be okay. So now what we need to do is look at the 2764 data sheet, and we'll probably have to cut some traces and add some jumper wires to route everything to the proper pins. So let me go through this and basically draw on here what we need to do to make that cartridge 2764 compatible. Here's what needs to be done. This block on top represents the extra 4 pins the 64 has. And for instance, the red lines are what needs to be connected together. You can notice, for instance, that pin 26, which really on the original 4Ks is pin 24, says no connect, but that is already on the cartridge wired to VCC to 5 volts. And since it's a no connect, we can safely leave it connected to 5 volts and then connect the programming voltage, the programming pin, VCC, and the programming voltage, all to 5 volts, because that's how it needs to be hooked up for a normal read operation. We need to give it A12, address 12, and really all that we here happened was the A11 and the chip select pin were swapped on the original 4K, so we swap them back. They had output enable tied to chip enable or chip select. You can safely tie output enable to ground because chip select, if chip select is high, output enable is ignored. So this is actually an extra select line, but on these EEPROMs we just tie it to ground and everything's fine. So on these 3 we need to cut the traces, and then I need to see if A12 is connected to anything, and if yes, cut the trace, but otherwise here are the connections we need. And the very first thing we need to do is to gently remove the ROMs from the existing cartridge, and then figure out how we're going to locate a socket in there. First, if it's going to fit height-wise. Second of all, it's going to extend beyond the board here because of the extra pins. And make sure if we do everything like this that we can put it back into the cartridge shell. The ROMs came out cleanly. I measured, and my former diagnosis was right. The left ROM was shorted. VCC to ground. This one doesn't have a short, but I don't know if it's good or not. And I didn't have a 28-pin socket, but I made one because it seems that I have a whole bunch of 32 pins, but no 28s. At least not the. I have a bunch of machined ones, but you don't want to use machined ones here. So I got to figure out how to put a square peg into a round hole, and then start looking at my diagram and start cutting traces and adding some connections. Okay, here are the results. Looks kind of clean on top. There's some cuts. Let's see. Here. Gets a little messier here and here. And the extra pins just overhang. Here and here. I put some tape to insulate the legs from not touching it and just wired everything together. I burned an EEPROM. And there she is, ready to be tested. Okay, I'm not even going to put it back in the case yet. I did double check. When you just have a bare PCB, the component side faces away from the keyboard. And got to close the door. And then pray to the universe. And here we go. Come on. Hey, that is cool. That is very cool. Except there's two issues remaining. I get a prompt and I have no idea. Oh. Okay, that's was kind of jumping too far ahead. I have documentation. The field service manual for the Atari describes that. I better go and peruse that. And the second issue is it going to fit into the cartridge shell? And look at that. It fit. When I first put it in, I had this board upside down, and I was getting ready to trim a bunch of plastic underneath, but then I finally realized that when you put it in the right way, it fits. And it's secure in here, so let's put the back cover on. And the back cover fits. And we take off the ugly tape and the part that says bad. I'll clean that up. Put the fastening screw in there. Atari was really very considerate in making the 800 cartridges easy to open up without having to destroy labels. That's not true for third-party cartridges, but Atari's own is great. So now, fits, and 3, 2, boom. So we got a standalone system test. And as threatened before, I'm going to go read the docs a little bit, clean up my workspace here. And then we can actually go in and test The original purpose of this was, remember, the joystick trigger was not being registered. Okay, so I figured out the test, and all you had to do was press a P on the keyboard. It says, well, I'll show you later. Basically, it failed on the controller test, but it did say, the big one here is insert controller test plugs. So there's some sort of shorting blocks you have to put in here for it to test the controller ports, and I wasn't going to find out and build a bunch of plugs and everything, so I did what I originally expected and looked at the schematics, and it's actually not that complicated. We have the directions and the button here are just momentary switches, and the data lines that go in here from all of the controllers are pulled high, and when you do a direction or you click the button, it just grounds the button. So the inactive state is a logic 1 and the active state is a logic 0. All I had to do was find out where do these go and hope that it went to someplace easy, but it didn't. It ended up, of all things, on the graphics chip. So here's a CPU board, which doesn't want to come out, and where is it? A501. It ended up on this chip, but that's the graphics chip. Why would it end up there? My best guess is that, it's a custom Atari chip. When they made this chip, they had a few extra pins left over, and they said, hey, let's make those digital inputs and read the trigger buttons through those. It wasn't the pokey, the POTS and keyboard chip. It wasn't any of the CMOS, nothing. It had to be that chip. So I robbed one out of another device, and the triggers started to work. So, with the new chip it works. That means the connections are good, everything's good. The only possibility is that the old chip went bad. So I replaced it and everything started to work. So let me go through the lengthy process and put this thing back together before I forget how I took it apart, and then I'll show you what the test tells us. Okay, it's back together. The good news is there's no leftover parts, screws, washers, wires, anything like that. And also what I did in the meanwhile was I checked, and there's a newer version of the SALT diagnostic. But as I mentioned, it still doesn't like the joystick ports. And the reason for that is most likely, so you hit P, and it says port test. And you hit enter or return, and it says insert jumper plugs in ports. So they have some sort of null modem type sockets or something that you need to insert into all the joystick ports, which are down here. And what I'm guessing those are they're simply grounding the direction bits and the trigger bit, and then the computer tests to see if it reads all zeros, i.e. meaning everything is active. At least that's what I think. It says press return key when ready, and it tells us that it failed because we don't have the plugs in there. However, as we saw before, it looks like I found the problem the old-fashioned way, and this machine's fixed now. So let's see how fixed it is. So I pulled a game that's kind of ironic because Nintendo actually licensed Donkey Kong to Atari. Little did they know that Nintendo was going to kick their behinds and put them out of the game console business. But I guess at this point everybody was still happy. So all we got to see is, does this work? So we plug the controller back in, and the button seems to work. Seems to work fine. And I saved her. So, as you can see, this game now works. Well, the Atari works fine. And I didn't start this video out. I was looking for something neat to do user-wise using the Atari 800, but obviously the chip took a dive and we had to go in a totally different direction here. But the good thing is that the machine got fixed, and we now have this cartridge here that is basically a universal cartridge for Ataris, because we can put any kind of, I'll be quiet. So if we open up the cartridge, again, you saw it before, but all you got to do is burn your new image up to 8K, and then just plug it in here, and that's it. Now there's other much better solutions for doing that. The Atari was extremely popular in its day, and people spent hours and hours on coming up with more convenient ways to play games, but this one's kind of cool. And next time we'll do something, or one of the next videos we'll do something with the 800, which, you know, not repair it, but actually do something semi-useful with it. Thanks for watching. A like, a subscribe, and all the other good stuff would be appreciated. And we'll see you next time. And thank you to Harold Bow for his donation.